The Veterans Affairs officer couldn't believe it when he found Tommy in the park. "Are you Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the hero of Fallujah?" Tommy nodded slowly. "We've been looking for you for 2 years. There are medals that belong to you. Welcome to Shadow Veteran Stories." Have you ever walked past someone on the street and wondered what their story really was? Before we dive into Tommy's incredible journey from the streets back to honor, let me ask you, have you ever encountered a homeless veteran? What did you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you think every veteran deserves recognition, please hit that like button and subscribe to help us share more stories like this. Lincoln Park had always been Tommy Rodriguez's refuge. For the past 8 months, the weathered bench under the old oak tree had served as his bedroom dining room, and the closest thing to home he'd known since returning from his 3rd tour in Iraq. At 34, Tommy looked older than his years. His face was weathered by too much sun and not enough sleep. His clothes were clean but worn, and his military-issued backpack held everything he owned in the world. Most people who passed by saw exactly what they expected to see: another homeless veteran who couldn't get his life together. They'd walk a little faster, avoid eye contact, and sometimes mutter under their breath about those people who couldn't adapt to civilian life. Tommy had heard it all before. Some days, he almost believed it himself. What they didn't see was the Purple Heart medal wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt at the bottom of his pack. They didn't know about the Bronze Star that had been awarded posthumously to his team leader, or about the night in Fallujah when Tommy had carried 3 wounded Marines to safety while under heavy enemy fire. They didn't know that the explosion that saved his squad had also taken something from him that he was still trying to find. On this particular Wednesday morning, Tommy was doing what he did every day, trying to stay invisible. He'd learned that invisibility was the key to survival on the streets. Don't cause trouble, don't ask for anything, and maybe people will leave you alone. He was carefully organizing the few belongings in his pack when he noticed someone approaching with purposeful steps. David Chen was a caseworker with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and he'd been walking through parks and shelters for the better part of 2 years. He carried a folder thick with papers and a tablet loaded with photos and service records. His job was to find veterans who had fallen through the cracks, men and women who deserved help but had somehow disappeared from the system. Today, something made him look twice at the man on the bench. There was something familiar about the posture, the way the man held himself even in these circumstances. David approached slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal. "Excuse me," David said gently. "I'm David Chen, with Veterans Affairs. I don't mean to bother you, but could I ask your name?" Tommy looked up warily. He'd had encounters with social workers before, most of them well-meaning but ultimately powerless to change anything meaningful. "Tommy?" he said simply. "Tommy what?" David asked, pulling out his tablet. "Rodriguez." David's fingers moved across the screen, and his expression changed dramatically. His eyes widened, then narrowed as he studied the photo on his device, then looked back at Tommy. "Staff Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's back straightened involuntarily. Nobody had called him by his rank in years. Are you the Tommy Rodriguez from the 1st Battalion? 3rd Marines, Fallujah, 2006. Tommy felt something twist in his chest. Those words brought back memories he'd spent years trying to bury. The heat of the Iraqi sun, the weight of his gear, the sound of incoming mortars, and the faces of men he'd never see. "Again, yeah," he said quietly. "That was me." David Chen sat down heavily on the bench, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the folder he'd been carrying. "Mr. Rodriguez, Sergeant Rodriguez, I've been looking for you for 2 years. The entire VA has been looking for you." Tommy laughed bitterly. "Right, sure you have. I'm serious," David said, pulling out a stack of official documents. "You have unclaimed benefits, medical care authorizations, and—" He paused, reaching deeper into the folder. 3 medals that were never properly presented to you. The color drained from Tommy's face. "What medals?" David pulled out a small velvet box and opened it carefully. Inside was a Silver Star medal, its ribbon bright against the dark fabric. "This is yours, Sergeant, for your actions on November 15th, 2006, when you single-handedly rescued 3 wounded Marines under enemy fire and called in airstrikes that eliminated an insurgent stronghold." Tommy stared at the medal as if it were a ghost. November 15th. He remembered that day with perfect, terrible clarity. The IED that had torn through their convoy, the screaming, the blood, the impossibly long sprint across open ground while bullets went past his head. "I don't understand," Tommy said. "I never got any medals. When I came back, they processed my discharge and that was it. I got my Purple Heart for the shrapnel wounds, but nobody ever mentioned there was a clerical error," David explained. "Your paperwork got mixed up with another Marine who had a similar name. Your medals have been sitting in a vault at Quantico for 8 years, but that's not all. He pulled out more documents. You're entitled to 100% disability compensation for PTSD and traumatic brain injury. That's $3,400 a month, backdated to your discharge date. You're owed over $300,000 in back pay. Tommy felt the world spinning around him. He'd been living on the streets, dumpster diving for food, hiding from police, all while the government owed him enough money to completely change his life. This has to be a mistake, Tommy whispered. It's not a mistake, David said firmly. You're a hero, Sergeant Rodriguez. What you did in Fallujah saved lives. Your squad leader's report says you carried Staff Sergeant Williams 200 yards while under direct fire from a sniper. You went back for Corporal Martinez even though the building was about to collapse. And when that insurgent position opened up, you called in danger-close airstrikes on your own position to protect the evacuation. The memories came flooding back. Williams screaming that he couldn't feel his legs, Martinez trapped under concrete, and rebar, the radio crackling with urgent voices as Tommy tried to coordinate medical evacuation while keeping 3 wounded Marines alive. Williams made it home, David continued, reading from the report. He lost his leg, but he's alive. He's married now, has 2 kids. Martinez recovered fully and finished his 20 years in the Corps. They both submitted statements for your Silver Star recommendation. Tommy's hands were shaking now. He'd wondered about his squad mates, but had been too afraid to look them up, too afraid of what he might find. There's more, David said gently. The community has been looking for you too. When word got out that we were searching for the hero of Fallujah, people started asking questions. Turns out you have more support than you know. As if on cue, Tommy heard his name being called from across the park. He looked up to see a man in his 50s approaching with purposeful strides. The man was wearing a VFW jacket and had the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform. Tommy Rodriguez, the man called out. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez? That's me, Tommy replied, still stunned by everything David had told him. Sir, I'm Mike Williams. Staff Sergeant Williams, you saved my life in Fallujah. Tommy's jaw dropped. The man approaching looked nothing like the young Marine he remembered, but the voice was unmistakable. Williams had filled out, gained some gray hair, and walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were the same. Williams? Tommy stood up slowly. But how did you— David called me when he thought he'd found you, Williams explained, reaching out to shake Tommy's hand. I drove down as soon as I could. Martinez is flying in from California tomorrow. Williams looked at the bench where Tommy had been sitting, at the worn backpack and the careful way Tommy had been guarding his possessions, and his expression grew serious. Tommy, what happened? After Fallujah, you just disappeared. We tried to find you, but the Corps said you'd been discharged and they couldn't give us any information. Tommy sat back down heavily. For 8 years, he'd carried the weight of that day alone. He'd never talked to anyone about what he'd seen, what he'd done, or how it had changed him. I came back different, Tommy said quietly. The nightmares, the flashbacks. I couldn't sleep, couldn't hold a job. Every loud noise made me hit the deck. I kept seeing Martinez trapped under that concrete, kept hearing you screaming. The VA said it would take months to process my claim and I couldn't wait. I couldn't function. He paused, looking at his hands. I lost my apartment, then my car. Started drinking to try to shut off the memories. One thing led to another, and I ended up here. I figured it was what I deserved. William sat down beside him. Tommy, you saved our lives. What you did that day, carrying me out when I couldn't walk, going back for Martinez even though that building was coming down, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You don't deserve to be living on the streets. David opened his folder again. Sergeant Rodriguez, I have emergency housing authorization papers right here. I can get you into a transitional facility today, and we can start processing your benefits immediately. You'll have your first check within 2 weeks. Tommy looked at the papers, then at Williams, then at David. After 8 years of being invisible, of being treated like a problem to be avoided, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. I don't know if I can do this, Tommy said. I don't know if I remember how to be around people, how to live inside again. Williams put a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do it alone. The VFW has a whole network of guys who've been where you are. We help each other out. That's what we do. Over the next hour, more people began arriving at the park. David had made some phone calls, and word had spread through the veteran community faster than wildfire. A representative from the Marine Corps League showed up with a formal proclamation. A local news reporter arrived, though David made it clear that any interviews would be entirely up to Tommy. Most importantly, other veterans started showing up. Men and women from different eras, different conflicts, but all united by the understanding of what Tommy had been through. They didn't offer pity or condescension. They offered brotherhood. You know what the hardest part was? Tommy said as the group gathered around the bench. People would look at me and see failure. They'd see someone who couldn't cut it in the real world. Nobody ever asked about my service, about what I'd done. I started believing maybe they were right. An older veteran named Frank, who'd served in Vietnam, spoke up. Son, I lived in my car for 6 months after I got back from Southeast Asia. Took me years to get right. Nobody understood what we'd been through. The difference is we understand now. We know how to help. David pulled out the final piece of paperwork. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is a formal apology from the Department of Veterans Veterans Affairs for the administrative errors that led to your benefits being delayed. It's signed by the Secretary himself. What happened to you should never have happened to any veteran. Tommy took the letter and read it slowly. For the first time in years, he felt something other than shame about his situation. He felt anger, not at himself, but at the system that had failed him. What about the other guys? Tommy asked. I can't be the only one who fell through the cracks. You're not, David admitted. That's why we're expanding the outreach program. Finding you proves that there are others out there who need help. Your case is going to help us find them. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering in the park took on the feeling of a reunion. Veterans shared stories, phone numbers were exchanged, and plans were made. Williams insisted that Tommy stay with his family until the transitional housing was ready. Martinez called from the airport to say his flight had been moved up and he'd be there by evening. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a young mother approached the group with her two small children. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. Are you the veterans they've been talking about on the news? Williams nodded. Yes, ma'am. Is there something we can help you with? I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. My husband is deployed right now, and knowing that people like you are looking out for each other, it means everything to families like ours. Tommy looked at this young woman and her children and felt something shift inside him. For years, he'd seen his service as something that had broken him, something that had led to his downfall. But looking at this mother's face, he remembered why he'd enlisted in the first place. Ma'am, Tommy said, standing up and extending his hand. It's our honor to serve. And when your husband comes home, you make sure he knows there are people here who understand what he's been through. That evening, for the first time in 8 years, Tommy Rodriguez slept in a real bed. Williams had insisted he take the guest room, and Martinez had arrived just in time for dinner. As Tommy lay in the dark, listening to the sound of a family living their lives in the next room, he thought about the long road ahead. The money would help, certainly. Having a place to live would make everything easier. But the real gift had been something simpler. Being seen as a human being again, being recognized for what he'd given rather than judged for what he'd lost. 3 months later, Tommy was living in his own apartment and working part-time with David Chen's outreach program. His job was to walk through parks and shelters, looking for other veterans who had fallen through the cracks. He carried his own folder now filled with resources and phone numbers and stories of hope. The nightmares hadn't completely stopped, but they were manageable with proper treatment. The flashbacks were less frequent. Most importantly, Tommy no longer carried the weight of his memories alone. On the anniversary of that day in Fallujah, Tommy returned to Lincoln Park, not to sleep on the bench, but to remember how far he'd come. David Chen found him there, sitting quietly in the shade of the old oak tree. How are you doing, Sergeant? David asked. Better, Tommy replied. Different, but better. You know what the strangest part is? I spent all that time thinking I was invisible, thinking nobody cared. But people did care, they just didn't know where to look. David sat down beside him. We found 6 more veterans last month. All of them had stories similar to yours. Administrative errors, lost paperwork, people who just slipped through the system. And now they're getting the help they deserve. Because of you, Tommy. Because we found you first. Tommy thought about that for a moment. You know, I used to think that what happened in Fallujah was the end of my story. Like everything after that was just aftermath. But maybe it was really the beginning. As they sat in the park where Tommy's new life had begun, other veterans stopped by. Some were success stories like Tommy, others were just beginning their journey back. Each one carried their own invisible wounds, their own stories of service and sacrifice, but none of them were invisible anymore, and none of them were carrying their burdens alone. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Tommy Rodriguez, a veteran who served with honor but fell through the cracks, someone who needed recognition rather than judgment? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the hidden heroes in your community, because at Shadow Veteran Stories, we believe that every veteran deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be honored for their service. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Help us keep these voices alive, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they're sitting on park benches, carrying invisible wounds, and waiting for someone to see past the surface to the warrior within.